Presented by Australia India Council. All of you know Mary Beard very well. She's been here on the stage with wonderful sessions. But I'll just read a couple of lines about Mary. Mary Beard is one of the Britain's best-known classicists, a distinguished professor of classics at the University of Cambridge and fellow of Newham College. She has written numerous books on the ancient world, including the 2008 Wolfson Prize winner, Pompeii, the Life of a Roman Town. She had a session here yesterday, which was a wonderful session. And now to this session, Spice, History of a Temptation.
Thank you very much. And my job here is both to introduce Jack Turner and also prompt him as we go through. So it'll be question and answer, but a lot more answer than question. Jack is a really extraordinary, has an extraordinarily varied career. Started out in Melbourne, Australia, reading classics, knowing a range of phenomenally difficult languages in addition to Latin and Greek. He then fetches up in Oxford, doing international relations now, thanks to getting interested in Thucydides. He does a PhD in international relations, but he then changes direction to become a cultural, historical writer. The book we're going to be talking about is Spice, The History of a Temptation. Tells me that he's currently working on who does the cooking in history and the banning of that extraordinary drink absinthe. So I'm sure he'll be back in a year or two talking about absinthe.
I hope so.
But just to kick this off, when I agreed to introduce Jack, I did feel slightly anxious, and I thought there really is something a bit much about me coordinating a presentation on spice in India. It seems a bit of a nerve, really.
A bit cheeky, isn't it? Yeah, I felt exactly the same way. Well, yeah, actually, when I hopped on the plane in Paris to come here, I had what my worst nightmare is the chatty neighbour, the guy who wants to talk to you all the way. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going to India and a literary festival, and I'm going to talk about my book on spices." And at this point, he paused and he said, "You're going to India to talk about masala?" And I said, "Well, no, actually, it's not like that. So let me explain. What my book is about, essentially, is not. I'm not here to bring coals to Newcastle. Although I'm actually very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards, because a great deal that's in this book has close parallels, it seems to me, in India, parallels which are still very much alive. So this is one of those cases where the audience knows more than I do. My book is essentially about why the world beat a path to India's door, and why the world, not just India, all the spice-producing countries of Asia, and what it was about spices that exerted such a powerful, not to say magnetic, attraction on the countries of the West for many, many thousands of years, why it was they came here.
I have to say I read Jack's book with enormous pleasure, but one bit instantly spoke to me, because very near the beginning he goes back to the Romans, and he goes to the far north of Britain, to Hadrian's Wall, where some of the recent documents that have been discovered include the kind of accounting and laundry bills, letters to and from these poor soldiers garrisoned in this horrible climate, much worse than this, on Hadrian's Wall. And one of the things that appears in the account registers is the money they spent on pepper. And at this point, I thought, one's gobsmacked. You think that there's some poor little soldiers, guarding this outpost of empire, eating, no doubt, truly dire porridge day in, day out, but at least with some pepper to make it better. And then you think, well, yeah, that's really interesting. But,
I can relate to that.
How can you start to imagine that here we are, almost 2,000 years ago? How do those peppercorns? How do they actually get there? It's all very well to say, thank God we got the pepper, but how does it arrive from India to Scotland?
How does it physically
How does it get there?
Well, it's an extraordinary story. Basically, the Romans were certainly not the first Europeans to consume spices, and we'll come to that in a minute, but the Romans were the first to develop a mass traffic, and that's not an exaggeration. About 100 years before the Common Era, before the birth of Christ, the Romans were sending about 120 ships, around about 1,000 tons, which I'm not a maritime expert, but that's a big ship. About 120 ships of that order to India, more or less, not entirely, but mostly for pepper. This was the first civilization in the West, if you like, that really got that. And in a sense, this had been hidden in plain view for quite a long time. People who'd studied the literary sources had picked up these references to pepper. And it's an interesting sort of exercise in intellectual history, I suppose, because in a sense they were these references, and there's plenty in the poets, in historians, geographers, these references seem so weird, so improbable, that in a sense people didn't take them seriously or didn't pay much attention. So I did. When I was studying Latin literature, I was often struck by these things, and I knew enough. I'd spent a lot of my childhood in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, and so I knew where these spices were from, and I think maybe that was one of the problems. I mean, maybe European classicists didn't quite fathom how weird it was to have this Indian plant showing up in Northern Europe. But what changed relatively recently was in the archaeology of the 80s and 90s, people found physical remains of pepper, and they found, not least, they found graffiti left behind by Roman traders who did this long journey down through Egypt, across from the Nile to the Red Sea, hopped in the boat and sailed all the way to Kerala. And some of these people left extremely detailed graffitis along the lines of so-and-so was here, but they give the date, their name and everything. And in a sense, that's what it took to not reveal something new, but to, as I say, reveal something that was there in plain view. So I then got in touch with the people who curate some of these things at the British Museum, and I said, look, I'm really interested in these finds of pepper up at Vinderland. And they said, oh, we've got stacks of this stuff. We've got the wooden tablets that record it, but also they had a pepper pot, a beautiful little silver pepper pot. And it was clear that this was something which to Romans was quite startlingly familiar, and in a sense, probably, if the soldiers, who were certainly not terribly well paid, if the soldiers had it in their diet, then we're talking about a pretty significant trade. I haven't really answered Mary's question, which is how did it happen? I mean, it happened because there was money in it. There was big money in it, and enough merchants were able to get this pretty serious money together and sail all the way to India.
And they're getting pepper, and they're getting other perishable things, aren't they? They're getting materials, silks. That's
right, luxury items for the most part. Silk is huge. That comes from further east. That comes from China mostly, but they're getting a lot of things. Now, pepper, in a sense, one absolutely critical point to make very early on. One shouldn't be anachronistic about this. Pepper we can relate to. Pepper's a spice you put on your dinner. Straightforward. Most of the stuff, the other stuff that the Romans are getting, are actually going far more exotic and to the modern Western mind, not the ancient Western mind, but to the modern Western mind, more peculiar uses, which we can perhaps talk to in a minute.
And the other thing that's quite interesting is trade's a two-way process. The Romans coming away with pepper and things. What is India getting from the Romans?
In a word, they're getting silver, and so this is the beginning of a very significant development in East-West relations. If you go to some of the museums in Kerala now, you can see, bizarre as it may seem, some of the best preserved and largest hoards of Roman silver are in southern India. And the reason for that is Roman coinage in the Roman Empire was used as coinage, and so it gets worn, it gets sometimes it gets debased, but it gets lost, it gets picked up and used for other purposes. In Kerala, it tends to be hoarded. So the rulers of these states that we don't know a great deal about collected the silver and hoarded it. And what's really interesting is that there was immense opposition to this in Rome. There was a real sense that Rome was giving up all of its silver for something of no real worth. And in terms of intellectual history, what's fascinating is this idea. I mean, the economic reality is the flow of silver globally runs west to east. So all of these things that the East, that China had, that India had, Southeast Asia had, the West had nothing that they could exchange in return. The early English traders tried selling woolens, which is not going to fly. It's all they had, except for hard currency. And this idea, this fear, which is, as I say, based on an economic reality of draining the money and sending it all east, that starts with Rome, and that's an idea that runs all the way through to the imperial period.
So this is
colonial period.
This is fine. You know, I get this while the Roman Empire is there, and I can see the way they're going, how the trade routes are working, what the exchange principle is. But then the question is, the Roman Empire, at least in the West, collapses. Mm-hmm. What happens? Does the trade continue then, and how outside the context of the Roman Empire?
Right, this is fascinating. Certainly the trade collapses, and the old idea was for a long time, and I don't want to sort of disembowel a straw man, but the old idea was that with the collapse of the Roman Empire, everything just came to a grinding halt, and that suddenly the East sort of receded over the horizon, and to an extent that's true. Certainly the spice trade goes down, but what I found through going through these old, largely monastic records, is that you find the eastern spices, principally pepper, but plenty of other ones, cropping up all the way. So 6th century there are references. The Emperor Justinian is when he dies, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian dies in help me here, Mary, 530 thereabouts. When he dies, he's embalmed in spices. So he's getting, now that's probably not so mysterious, because Byzantium retains a very distant but a land connection with India. But what's even more startling is, again, up around Hadrian's Wall, the Venerable Bede, the first, according to some historian of the English, on his deathbed, he says to his disciple Cuthbert, who's his hagiographer in due course, he says, "Cuthbert, take my most precious belongings." And the hagiographer makes a big deal of this, because Bede, being a saintly sort of person, is not interested in gold and silver, but his most spiritually valuable possessions are pepper, linen, and incense. And these are all Eastern products, and that's astonishing. We're talking about the 7th century here, when basically, according to the conventional wisdom, no English trader could put a ship on the water. There's supposed to be Vikings stopping all of that. And the more I looked, and believe me, you find these references all over the place. These spices crop up in pretty much every century. So certainly the trade does go down, but the appetite is still there. The demand is still there for reasons which are essentially those which existed in the time of the Romans.
And who's handling the trade from the western end?
Right.
It doesn't just happen.
Right. The simple answer is we don't know. Now, the prime candidate, because obviously the Mediterranean is broken up. In the north, you have a couple of barbarian kingdoms, more or less, call them that, with just a regional or local writ. The rest of the Mediterranean is essentially a Muslim lake. There's no Christian shipping. Venice is in the future, all of that. There's no traffic across the Mediterranean. So who can bridge that divide? And the only plausible answer, it seems to me, are these Jewish traders who crop up in various references. In the time of the Carolingian Empire, you get references to these Jewish traders who could, and it seems to me, this is pure speculation, but it seems to me they're the only people who could possibly travel from one world into the other.
The other thing I wanted to know, you can see that I have a sort of, I err towards the Romans, but there's not as after, there's before, because you do get references to pepper and other forms of spices in classical Greek literature going back, to the 5th century. Mm-hmm. But what's the earliest was the earliest date you can actually be sure that there has been that travelling of pepper and spices from east to west.
Right. Well, the nugget of fact, if you like, this is the first piece of hard information came up via Egypt. There's a lovely story that yesterday Mary was talking about curatorship in museums, and in the Egyptian museum in the 70s, the mummy of Ramses II was getting in a very bad way. Now, Egyptian archaeology is blessed by the fact that the climate is so dry, so things are naturally preserved. But what happened was when Ramses II was put in a museum, those conditions didn't really apply. In the museum, he was in basically a glass box. There was no fancy dehumidificator or whatever. He was just in this box, and people could lean over and breathe on him, and the air changed with the air conditioning and whatnot. The conditions in terms of curatorship were pretty abysmal. In fact, there was someone wrote a book about this. Someone found some tobacco in an Egyptian mummy, and they said this proves that the Egyptians were in touch with the Americas. But in fact, it was someone having a smoke over. It fell in. But what happened was Ramses was in such a bad state that, having been preserved for the best part of 3,000 years, he died in 1224 BC. He was getting in such a bad state, and insects were nibbling him, that he was sent to Paris, to the Musée de l'Homme, which is the Museum of Anthropology in Paris, for a sort of, I don't know, what do we call it? A makeover, beautician's trip. He was getting a facelift, and they did the most sort of extensive examination of him, of the mummy or since conducted. And perhaps the most remarkable find was up his nose. So there's no dispute. This didn't fall in from some visitor. This was right up his nose and put in place with a couple of resin plugs. Up his nose were a couple of peppercorns. So just to reiterate, pepper is native to the Malabar coast. It's a native of Kerala. And in the colonial period, it was distributed largely by the British all around their colonial empire. But in that time, there was no disputing. It grew in India, it didn't grow anywhere else. That's not to be questioned. It's not to be questioned, it was up Ramses' nose. So, how did it get there? We don't know. We know nothing. We can speculate a pretty good, well, in fact, we know pretty well why it was there. We can talk about that in a second. So that, if you like, is the first sort of rock-solid fact. There's plenty of earlier ones, and hopefully we can talk about that a bit. There's plenty of earlier ones, but they tend to, there's always someone who disagrees, or there's some question. A lot of the evidence is linguistic, and linguistic evidence is always bedeviled by different interpretations, or someone chooses to transliterate a word differently. But the pepper was up Ramses' nose, and there's no doubt in that. 1224. As to why it was there, well, that's interesting, because one of the things about this subject is, and in a sense the reason why I wrote this book, is it's very easy to be anachronistic, to transpose our assumptions back into the past. And we know that spices are flavourings, right? That's what, we put them on our food, we cook with them. That's not what Ramses thought, obviously. This was an object which pepper...
And it wasn't just stuck up his nose by chance.
Well, no, it's clearly part of so it's clearly part of the mummification process, and as I'm sure everyone knows, the process of mummification involves a sort of disemboweling of the corpse, and then its preservation with various, it's desiccated, and then it's dressed with various herbs and spices, and the reason being that the chemical reason, if you like, is that all spices are in different ways anti-bacterial. They have a very strong microbiological effect. So what the pepper does is it kills the bacteria that would decompose the flesh. And that, if you like, makes, in a context of embalming or mummification, makes absolutely perfect sense. It's the sort of formaldehyde, if you like, of the ancient world. We don't know, I shouldn't exaggerate. That's an isolated find. There's nothing else, but you can see the attraction to the Egyptians is absolutely obvious, and that's the first thing we know about it.
And Romans sometimes also use mummification. Both in Roman Egypt, but also in Roman Italy. Presumably, they're using spices for that.
And again, you always got to be careful about being anachronistic. That we can be too functional, if you like. I said the formaldehyde. Forget that. That's a bad analogy, or it's only half of it. Because the other critical thing, certainly with the Romans as well, is the notion of aroma. And the aroma, if you like, of sanctity or the aroma. There's a godliness to a good aroma, which is seen as being propitious in the context of a burial. So one thing you find often in the Roman context, certainly in the late imperial period, emperors are sometimes cremated on a bed of cinnamon. Now we relate that to the myth of the phoenix, the myth of the phoenix, as I'm sure you all know, is that when the phoenix dies, it catches fire in a bed of cinnamon, and the whole thing, there's this inferno, and then it's born again. So there's some association there, and this aroma, as I say, is immensely propitious. And in a quite literal sense, and that, I think I'm a little bit allergic to these generalizations, but here one can generalize. Pretty much all of the religions of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East have this close association between a pleasant smell and divinity. So in Homer, for instance, when a god shows up, there's a famous scene in Hera's seduction. Again, I'm talking to the expert, but the god shows up and this wonderful smell wafts through. So the godliness is somehow quite literal. And the word ambrosia means immortal, and yet ambrosia is something fragrant, something heavenly in it. I mean, we still talk about a heavenly aroma, and this is a very this notion exists in the Mediterranean world, and for that matter in Western Christendom throughout the medieval period. We talk about the aroma of sanctity, and this idea crosses over from the antique pagan world into Christendom seamlessly, it seems to me, because one of the constant notions that you get, like we just talked about Bede and his hagiographer, this notion of the holy person smelling fabulous, and when they die, they don't decompose. You know, they're always miraculously preserved. Like if you go to Goa, you can see St. Francis Xavier, I nearly said Sir Francis. St. Francis Xavier sitting there in his box, miraculously preserved. He doesn't look too well preserved to me, but he looks like an old locust or something. This notion that they somehow, that divine people or people touched by the divine smell fabulous is something that passes all the way through. And readers of Dostoevsky will remember the scene in Brothers Karamazov where the supposedly holy man Father Zosimus dies, and his supporters are terribly downcast when his corpse starts to smell, because it suggests that it's all been a bit of a fraud. Anyway, the point is that to associate the corpse with spices is somehow to associate them in quite a literal sense with a state of divinity.
No, that's absolutely great, because it's always one of the things that was most puzzling to me when I first started reading Greek literature, that the gods came in various disguises, so you could never quite be certain who was a god till you got and smelt them.
Right.
And that was absolutely key diagnostic. If you carried an old lady over a stream, you suddenly went, nice smell.
She smells
you
right,
knew
right.
it was a god.
Well, I mean, without sort of trivialising it, I mean, the ancient world was a much smellier place in lots of respects. And the physical realities of sacrifice, you're killing an animal there, and so some of these temples must have smelled like abattoirs. They didn't have jiff, they didn't have bleach, to clean these things. So it was very important to produce a strong, a competitive smell that you can put in the temple and that you can drive out that pretty filthy smell.
So we've got cooking, with which we're familiar. We've got these poor guys on Hadrian's Wall putting pepper into this awful sticky porridge, and Romans were always loading their recipes with pepper. We've got some kind of the process of embalming, the religious association, and so forth. But I think quite interestingly, you call your book The History of Temptation.
Right.
And that sort of made me think that there might be something more than embalming.
Right. We need to talk about sex. Very strangely, this it might seem an odd pairing, but in fact it's absolutely fundamental. And here perhaps the Mediterranean world parts company a bit. But before we can talk about that, we need to talk about medicine, which is, these categories are all artificial to an extent. We talk about cuisine and medicine. In fact, that distinction doesn't really make a great deal of sense. But an important thing to understand is that until, say, the 17th century, Western medicine, Mediterranean medicine, Roman medicine was humoral medicine. And so, this needs no explaining in India, but we're talking about hot, cold, dry and wet. These are the classifications by which all ailments are diagnosed and according to which doctors prescribe. And so, in a sense, this becomes, particularly where you're talking about cold, soggy Northern England, if you have a disease which is, according to the physician's diagnosis, a cold disease, and you get plenty of them if you live up there. For instance, if you get a cold, if you're suffering from something like melancholy or depression, the prescription for that ailment is something to counteract those symptoms. It has to be something hot and dry. Now the fact is that those things are extremely scarce. They don't exist in a native state pretty much in Europe. There's nothing like that. Hence spices. So they become extraordinarily important because really they're the only thing out there, if you like, that matches this problem. Hugely significant. Again, we go back to the aroma here. Hugely significant in this context is the notion of miasma, and the Greeks and the Romans and likewise in medieval Europe, there was this notion of airborne contagion. That you picked up something from a bad smell, or being in an environment where often you didn't appreciate miasma, it just got you, it came in the air, and you got sick. And this is a hugely important idea because the corollary, the logical corollary, is you counteract that with something that smells wonderful, something quite pleasant. And again, spices are pretty much the only show in town. They're the only thing, if you like, that you can carry around with you. They're small, they're powerful, compact, that will drive off those bad smells, or keep you safe. So that's the sort of diet. That medical logic ties in completely with dietetics. And again, until pretty recent times in Europe, there was a notion, which again, from what my tiny amount of knowledge about this country is alive and well here, which is the notion of balance. That when you cook something, it wasn't just making something taste nice. That idea is a pretty modern notion, actually. You had to cook food according to its properties, and you had to balance things. So if you're cooking something that's, say for instance, I'm diagnosed as a melancholic type, I really shouldn't be eating food that's classified as cold and wet. I have to balance it. I have to put something hot and wet on the top to make it safe to eat, so I'm not going to come down with some horrible, make my melancholy worse. And that idea is this is still strong, alive and well in herbal medicine in the West, but it's, I think, to Western readers that needs quite a lot of explaining because it's been pretty much dismantled by, so for instance, it's very strong in Chinese cuisine. This notion of balance is still there. So that's absolutely fundamental.
So where does the sex come in?
Well, same logic. So exactly the same logic. We're talking hot, cold, dry, wet. This is the grid, if you like, of where you are. Sexual dysfunction, not enough or too much, is. It's there in the language. The hots. You've got. You get. The hotter you are, the more. And so this is why, for instance, the monastic diet is always, monks are always given cold stuff, fish and vegetables. The idea is that it keeps them. And this is not. It's not. It seems absurd, but it's actually not. It's totally.
It is absurd.
Well, it is absurd. Well, I think actually, I suspect many people here would not find that logic absurd. I think some people would say that's physiologically pretty much obvious. And likewise, again, in Chinese cuisine, that's not a contentious point. But in terms of the sort of medical explanation, if you like, of sexual dysfunction is that someone's physiology is not hot enough. He needs a bit of heating up, and he needs a bit of well, sometimes needs to be a bit wet as well. And the ultimate spice in that respect is ginger. So ginger is seen as the aphrodisiac par excellence of the ancient and medieval worlds, and until pretty recently, there's a slightly gruesome story. But one of my favourite poets is the French lyric François Villon. He's a lyric genius, and he'd a very sort of rough and violent life, and he spent a lot of time in prison. And the medieval French prison was no better than it had to be. He was tortured. And in one of his most beautiful poems is his testament, where he leaves all his possessions to various people. And he leaves to the torturer, the torturer in chief. He's called the woodworker because he made all these horrible things in wood, like a rack or, I don't know, a wheel on which he was stretched. He leaves him a bit of ginger so he can go and get laid and lighten up a bit and stop torturing people. And that's a again, it's as odd as it may seem, it's not medically controversial. It's not even seen as superstitious. This is the medical logic that's there since Hippocrates and is enshrined in all the medical writings. And it's only really in the 17th and 18th centuries that humoral medicine starts to get. But aphrodisiac. So the other side of that, of course, is not everyone views this in the same way. Whether one approves of this of aphrodisiacs depends a lot upon your context. And so this is, as I say, where perhaps the West and the East part company a bit, because precisely because of this, spices are seen as somewhat dangerous things. You can't go around shoveling them in because the consequences will be, I'm not saying it's like popping a Viagra after dinner or something, but it's along those lines. It's something that's not, the people we know most about, unfortunately, are these monks who write everything down, but they're the ones who say, we mustn't, these things are utterly antithetical to our way of living. Because they're aphrodisiacs.
So is it the case then that, while it's easy enough to say, look at this vast, say, Roman trade, 120 ships a year bringing back pepper, etc. It looks as if what we've got is a completely open market in the Roman Empire. All this stuff, everybody's actually itching to get it. So there are also guys saying that these spices really are targeted.
Yeah, and I've stressed the sex there. The other element, of course, is that pepper being the exception, most of these they're luxury items. They're phenomenally expensive, and less so in Roman times, precisely because the trade was so colossal. The value of these things came down. So Rome, before the 18th century, is probably the last time when pepper was readily available. Amazing. I mean, think about that for a second. It's nearly 2,000 years before pepper becomes affordable to the average Joe. But the other great problem, of course, is their cost. And so, because these are luxury items, incredibly expensive, they're seen as being associated with the mega rich, which they were. So it's that sense of temptation is twofold: physically, seductive, but also ostentatious. And of course, what's so fascinating about this, you've probably noticed there's it's the same with my next book, Absinthe. I'm obsessed with these, I'm fascinated by these substances that come along from time to time historically, and they have this twofold attraction and repulsion, and of course one feeds off the other. The fact that they're dangerous, that you've got to avoid it. It's like, anyone here with a teenage kid say, don't smoke marijuana. Try that. That you actually prohibition does the opposite of what it's supposed to do. It has this, and like I said, it's a mutually reinforcing dynamic. So the dangerousness of spices, if you like, is precisely what makes them so wildly attractive.
It's no fun unless someone's saying,
But that sense of danger starts a very old, again, I'm a bit allergic to this word, but a very old discourse about Eastern luxury coming, where these, starts with the Romans who say, where these martial olive oil and bread-eating types and, granddad out there on the farm, we don't do this Eastern stuff. It's expensive, but it's effeminizing, it's luxurious and somehow weakens our sinews. It's not who we are, it's not what we are. And yet at the same time, the wealthier they get, there's this class that just can't get enough. And that image of the East, don't need to tell you, that keeps going. And
I think there's another aspect to it though, isn't there? It's that there is something grossly luxurious about substances that are so small, ephemeral, that you're going to burn or eat, that cost such a lot of money. This is not like storing up or investing in gold coins. They're not permanent. The whole point is, isn't it, that you buy them in some way to destroy or consume them. And so you put all this money into something that's just gone. You just light it and it's gone, or you eat it. So it's like, the story of Cleopatra dissolving her pearl in her wine. That it is enormously transgressive of not just good old Roman ways of doing things, but proper economic, sustainable, prudent forms of wealth gathering.
Oh, sure. It's like, throwing dollars at the dancer. It's the most effective form of conspicuous consumption if it's here today and completely gone tomorrow.
Yeah.
I mean, in the most rarefied form of that, again, these things have been totally secularized and made, well, I don't know if the word exists, banalized, you'd say in French or something, but made common, ordinary, perfumes. And perfumes were wildly expensive because you need quite a lot of spices to get the concentration. And it's sheer ephemerality, the fact that it's, it evaporates, makes them more and more attractive, more useful in this sense. There's no better way of showing off than a scent that's strong.
I've got a couple more questions before we throw it to the audience. And the first is, I'm not quite sure how to put it really, it's so when did this kind of spice trade end and why did it end? Or has it ended? I mean, is there still a spice trade just in different forms?
Right. Well, yes. Okay. Yeah, we've glossed over the history of it, but basically if you like, the culminating moment of the spice trade is the late 15th, early 16th century, when all the discoverers set out looking for spices. And this is a classic case of consequences muddling causes. But if you go back and you read the narratives of Columbus or Vasco da Gama or the East India Company, of both the English and the Dutch, Magellan, very basic point, but the absolute centrality of spices is astonishing. And their success, if you like, in getting marine access to the spice producing countries is what kicks off, if you like, the golden age of spices in Europe, because suddenly they arrive once again in Roman volumes. The Portuguese go and muck around for 100 years, but the Dutch are the ones who really succeed in getting huge quantities back to Europe. In a sense, that's what their very success is what sows the seeds of the decline of this temptation we've been talking about, because from being expensive and rare, suddenly spices become much more available, much more common, and all these things we've talked about, their luxuriousness, their costliness, their exclusivity becomes no more, becomes a thing of the past. And I think, it's interesting to see this happens first with pepper, because we've seen it. It's been a sort of widely available to the Romans, but by the high medieval period, it's a luxury item. And then as the price comes down, you start seeing spice snobs, people saying, only poor people eat pepper, or this is a, and that's killing. That's what eventually sort of undermines them and takes away all that charm, if you like. And also, I mean, not least, when one of the effects of the broadening of the Western mind, the literal mapping of this part of the world, is suddenly these things which have been terribly mysterious. I mean, people literally believe they grew in paradise. Columbus, I mean, everyone thinks about Columbus as the sort of, the godfather, if you like, of the modern world, the guy who pulled the trigger on modernity. Well, he was barking mad. He believed he was sailing to paradise. He believed he was sailing to either paradise or to the Indies, to China. And he brought back all these samples of bark, some worthless tree, and said, here's cinnamon, it'd smell. And he had an Indian, there's some poor Carib who picked up a couple of parrots, and he showed them to the King and Queen of Spain and said, that's an Indian, and that's an Indian parrot, and this is cinnamon. I just didn't quite know how to harvest it, but that's why it doesn't smell. But the point of the story is this guy believed that he was going to paradise. That's where the spices grew. What happens in the 100 or so years after that is, as the isolated ship becomes a fleet, great fleets going out every year, the lands are mapped. That myth is punctured. That image of it's no longer over the, well, it's over the horizon literally, but these are places that are now known, that are not so exotic, that are not so strange. This is no longer where phoenixes incinerate themselves. It's a place, it's a real place. There are real trees with real people, and they cease. So we can't really, I think, ever capture that exoticism. I mean, it's gone. We know what the world looks like now. So.
I mean, in a way it's gone, but I mean, reading your book, I was struck, you know, I started to think about my own supermarket. And no, yes, it's true, pepper is not a luxury item in Western Europe. But on the other hand, there is, you know, upmarket supermarkets have their bank of overpriced cinnamon in very small packets. And what marks out their spice displays is all foreign sourced. You know, this is not mint and parsley, which grow in abundance in the UK. You know, it's cinnamon and nutmeg and other kinds of things. And I realised, I suppose, in a way that you don't understand, you can sometimes understand the trade routes of the past much better than the trade routes of the present. You know, I then started to think, I wonder how all that does come to my local Tesco or Waitrose. You know, where, you know, who is controlling the modern spice trade?
Well, that's the, yeah, well, I always have whenever I see one of these things, I always have a mental image of some marketing, some poor fellow working in the marketing department or advertising person thinking, they always call it exotic spices, and you know, it's a great act of historical forgetting, because in reading the early narratives of the first people who came out with the East India Company, heading up to the Mughal court, and they get served food which they recognise immediately because it's just like elite food back home. It's not strange, you know. This Mughal meaty, spicy cuisine is actually pretty similar to what Henry VIII was eating. Wouldn't push that too far, but the principles are the same. This is meaty stuff with lots of spices, and that's precisely what the elite ate back at home. So yes, they're exotic, but on the other hand, they're not exotic. They recognise this very much. But in the sort of the more narrow material answer is that with imperialism, basically all the colonial empires, with partial exception of the Dutch, do the same thing. They move plants around the world. So, you know, quinine goes from South America and it's grown commercially in Malaya. Coffee gets spread everywhere. Tea everywhere. Well, everywhere where you can grow it. And the same with the spices. So what the British do, what the Dutch do, is they take pepper off to Indonesia and Cambodia and these places, and the Dutch tried for a very long time to run a cut, well, and succeeded in keeping the cloves and nutmegs to themselves. They're in a sense the most freakish of the spices in an evolutionary sense, because they're confined to very, very narrow spaces. The clove grew on 5 tiny volcanic islands in the Moluccas. The biggest one's about a couple of kilometres in diameter. It's just a volcano that just comes out of the sea. There's 5 of them. That's where the clove grew, nowhere else. And likewise the nutmeg, a couple of 100 kilometres to the south, grew on a tiny volcanic group, nowhere else. And for about 150 years the Dutch succeeded in creating an embargo, which they enforced ruthlessly to stop anyone else getting their hands on these plants and spreading them around. Whereas the British had a much more, their attitude was, we've got to create economic opportunities around the empire. We have to take these spices and cultivate them and grow them on a mass scale. But like I say, that's killing in terms of their exoticism.
It's very interesting the way that the idea of the empire, of the imperial control over the natural world is terribly strong. One of the things that's always struck me very forcibly about the triumphal processions that the Romans had through the streets of Rome after their victories. They didn't just take, you know, the coin and the booty and the statues. They also took the plants, the balsam tree from Judea. So you're seeing, you know, the flora and fauna of the places that you've conquered, not just the riches. Yeah. But the last question I wanted to say is, how kind of rich a view do we have from the other, from the selling end of it? So, I mean, we've been thinking about the consumption end in the West of the spice trade that is bringing this back. And often when I read these things about Romans or their later descendants, the British, I also think that somewhere back there is somebody selling them something and laughing themselves silly. You say, do you know those idiots? They'll pay goodness knows what for this. They're such an easy touch. Do we have any kind of idea of how the people coming were viewed from the other side?
They probably thought they were barking mad. I mean, the simple answer to that is I simply don't know, except for a couple of fragments. There's an ancient Tamil word for pepper, which literally means the passion of the Greeks. So there was a sense of these guys are nuts about this, and I mean, this is a common imperial experience. I mean, you find the same in a very different context in Mesoamerica, the sense that why are these guys so interested in gold? I mean, we just don't get it. But no, I mean, that's not really. The book is about the appetite. It's about, as I say, it's about what the Europeans and the Mediterranean world saw in spices. But also, it's fascinating. But I think the probably concise answer is to go down to one of these museums in Kerala and see this pile of Roman silver and think, hey, they were laughing all the way to the back.
Yeah, thank you. I think now we ought to let other people contribute here. There are mics, and it's terribly difficult to see, but start away and the mics will circulate.
Oh, sorry. Hello, can't hear you.
Hello.
Yes.
The first question is that you have associated traditionally spices with helps to increase the libido.
Yes.
Does it mean that today the spices have become widely available and we consume so much that we are much more sexually active than our ancestors? Notwithstanding, studies after studies have shown that villagers or village life is much more sexually active than a modern urban stress.
Right. That's a tricky question. I think to each his own. I mean, I suspect. Okay. Well, I guess one answer is that I think studies, what we would call empirical studies of this, are pretty much non-existent. Maybe, I suspect, because the drug companies don't see any money in it, but on a sort of linguistic, cultural level, the language is so. I mean, spice up your life. Hang on. I looked it up in the thesaurus. This is what you get for spicy. It is aromatic, flavoursome, hot, piquant, pungent, savoury, seasoned, tangy, broad, hot, improper, indecorous, indelicate, off-colour, ribald, risque, scandalous, sensational, suggestive, titillating, unseemly. So that's the Collins thesaurus. So I guess I'm not an expert, but I think I suspect the truth behind aphrodisiacs is if you believe something, if the mind is willing, the body will follow. So if the belief is out there, perhaps that's all it takes. But as for the physiology, the isolated study, and this is a couple of years out of date, there was one study on cinnamon, and this is a tiny bit interesting. That these researchers fed a lot of cinnamon to one group of rats, and there was a control group of rats that didn't eat any cinnamon. And they found that the rats that ate a lot of cinnamon experienced abnormal genital growth and a huge increase in their sperm count, which is interesting. But like I said, that's to my knowledge, that's a completely isolated piece of research, and that's as much as I know. Yes, gentleman in the front. Behind you, yes.
Yeah, my question is more towards the food part. The way, for example, tomato was not native to India and was brought in by foreigners.
Tomato.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any, except the spices, apart from the spices, are there any written records of the food elements being exported to the outside world as well? The way the spices were used in Indian food, so the whole dishes being exported.
The whole dish.
Yeah. Are there any written records of that?
Not to my knowledge. I think it's not to my knowledge. I think the idea of, say, an Indian recipe reappearing, no. Whereas I think probably you're on safer ground when you start looking at particular prescriptions, certain medicines. And I think one of the great, we didn't talk about this at all, but one of the most important medical uses was as an antidote to poisons. And quite often in the ancient Greek and Roman sources, these have names, exotic names that associate them with faraway places. And there you get a very strong impression that that's a recipe that has come. But I think it's quite a long. You've got to look pretty much into the modern period before you find recipes transplanted wholesale. And one reason I think is that recipes are so bound up with one's sense of identity that you can import ingredients and things with the culture's sense of identity, but the recipes actually are quite resilient to change. The reverse process, though, you mentioned the tomato. I mean, the one we haven't talked about at all, and in this context, perhaps the most significant, of course, is the chili. I mean, the chili is an American species, and it's one of the spices found by Columbus in the Caribbean. He can't find pepper, but his method is to take pepper samples and give them to the Caribs, to the indigenous people he encounters. And he says, "You got any of this stuff?" And they say, "Well, no, but we've got this." And they give him the chili. And within 20 years, which given the state of communications is an astonishingly brief span of time, within 20 years, the chili pepper is pretty much everywhere in India, so much so that the botanicals of, say, 1540 in Europe refer to the American chili as the Indian pepper, getting it completely wrong. So it's a very fertile soil here, and it's an indirect answer, but it's a case of backflow, if you like, along the same route. So traffic went both ways. You know? Yes, in the front row. So we're privileging the people right in the front row here.
We'll go to the back after this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, with the microphone, so
Good afternoon.
Hello.
You've spoken wonderfully about the masala end of the definition of spice.
Yes.
But my understanding, the Latin use originally was that which can be exchanged for coin
right.
through Alexandria in the trade between the Romans and obviously the Indians.
Right.
And that wider definition included things like wood, included dancing girls, included
Right.
cotton, silk, and so on.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about the Maziris Papyrus and Strabo's 120 ships, and the revenue that the Roman Empire was generating through this trade between India and Rome through Alexandria is estimated recently by McLaughlin at 300 million sesterces
Right.
out of the 1,000 million sesterces total revenue. So this implies 30% of the Roman Empire's revenue came as a result of trade with India. To what extent, question to both of you, to what extent did all Roman roads lead to India?
Well, I'll put my pennyworth in first, which is to say a lot more than we used to think. Certainly, in just thinking about the direction of travel the Roman history has gone in over the last 30 or 40 years. When I was a student, we didn't mention, I was saying this at an earlier session at this festival, we didn't mention India. As Jack said, occasionally we noticed all this a bit of stuff in Strabo. We didn't take it very seriously. We were told, quite rightly in fact, that numerals as reported in Roman and Greek historians are decidedly unreliable, and we passed on. Now, I still think that I would be very wary about actually fixing the amount in cash, but what is absolutely clear from the excavations of the last 20 years and the stuff in Kerala, that there is big money here. And so some Roman roads led to India. Whether I go so far as to go any further than that.
Right. Yeah, I'd echo that. I think I'm certainly not up to speed with the last research you mentioned, but my very strong impression is that all ancient economic research is so bedeviled by numbers, and getting the numbers right is almost impossible. I would say what is indisputable, and in a sense the more important fact, is this mercantilist notion that this is somehow deeply dangerous, that Rome is bleeding its silver, bleeding its wealth, and that's a strong idea, and that idea, as I say, lives on. But the net flow of silver is definitely west to east. As for your other very good point that you raised about the meaning of the term, you're right. We didn't even touch on that. The word means lots of different things, as you say. It's cognate with specie, with coinage. Generally, in the late Roman context, it means something small and high value. So I'd maybe question the dancing girls bit, but I probably should have. And something. This is a critical notion. Something that's easily interchangeable. Right. So one of the problems with other high value goods is they can be adulterated, or there's ersatz versions out there. Or whatever. One of the wonderful things about spice is that it's a peppercorn's a peppercorn. It's a sure thing. I should have probably specified at the start that my subject is botanically limited to a certain number of species: pepper, clove, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger. But yes, very good point. Chap with the pink shawl. Very good idea to wear a pink shawl. You always get noticed by
I have a question. What? Oh, I have a question about, you said briefly that nutmeg and cloves were so highly regarded by the Dutch, and that they were kept in such small areas.
Sure.
So how did that also play out within the Indonesian archipelago as itself? Were they regarded as highly desired commodities in local contexts, or just abroad? So you say that in Tamil Nadu that the pepper is just kind of like, okay, throw it away.
Yeah.
But the clove is only grown in one place, so is that not also rare for everybody, or just for the Europeans?
Well, actually, it's important. I mean, this is out of my area, but important. The first reference we have to the clove is a Chinese reference from the 2nd century BC, and it's used whenever a courtier had to go to meet the emperor. It was very significant that he didn't have bad breath, so he had to chew on a clove. That was considered, and it's clear from that context that this is an imperial context. It's not clear, perhaps that's too strong a word. It's strongly suggestive that this is a very valuable and exotic item. I mean, the rule with luxury is, a fur coat is a luxury in Miami, and it's a commodity in Moscow. And the same is true of spices in Indonesia until.
I think we could time for just one more there, and then this lady on the front row has been extremely patient.
Yes,
So we can go there, and then that must be the last question.
So it's not relating to the spices that you were referring to in your book, but as you pointed out, as we all know, spices are so readily available in the West. But would you care to comment about the, it's probably because of the power of the pharmaceutical companies that the health aspects of turmeric, for example, very few Indians have Alzheimer's because of turmeric, and coconut oil for Parkinson's. In other words, this isn't history, the importance of spices. It's so relevant, and the awareness of it through research is only becoming more and more relevant. Care to comment?
Yeah, well, before we do, can we talk afterwards about turmeric? Because there's a lot to be said there. But one of the problems of big pharma is they go where the money is. And a pharmaceutical company looking at something like, you mentioned Alzheimer's, and I'm sure you're aware of the studies that have been done there on turmeric as an agent which hinders or even stops Alzheimer's. One of the problems, and I use that word probably inaccurately, the problem from the perspective of a big pharma executive is there's no money to be made. They can't bring to market turmeric as an Alzheimer's drug and make anything from it. So you're not going to see big pharma anytime unless they can patent it. As you probably know, there's a scandalous history of a big pharma company trying to patent turmeric in India, and the Indian government eventually saying, "I'm sorry, this is a common good. This is something that is common property. Can't be patented." But that said, big pharma have patented stacks of indigenous medicines and native plants and said, "We own this," and have then taken it on to use it as medicine. But I would, it's a problem that bedeviled my research into medicine, is that the research is not there. And the research is not there because, most medical research doesn't just occur because there's some, academic sitting there in his lab saying, "I'm going to research this." It occurs because they get a grant for research, and they get a grant from a big pharmaceutical company. It's where the money is. So I don't think that's going to change soon. And that's a real problem because you get this divide between, how should I call it, the kind of fringe, willing to believe anything totally bogus, I was going to say school, it's the wrong word, form of medicine versus the empirical, and it's a big problem. Sorry, yeah, very patient.
Last question.
I just wanted to ask you, in India, certain herbs have more than healing properties. Like, for example, there's this herb called chandan. I'm sorry, I don't know the English translation. It's supposed to help you with temper. If you're like a really angry person, if you apply chandan, it's supposed to help you with these things. And this isn't viewed as bogus in India. It's
Sure.
So, is there evidence of that kind of thinking ever spreading to the West? And if not, why not?
Oh, there's not evidence. There's a stack of it, read my book. There's a stack of, people believe this. This is scientific fact, if you like, of the day. And the day we're talking about, it's a long day. It's the ancient world through to sort of roughly the 17th century. If you're a choleric person and you should avoid pepper, it'll speed you up. It'll make you more choleric. I mentioned this, that so much of what is current in Ayurvedic thought about the properties of spices is shared with the West. It is there a long time ago, and it's only relatively recently that these things have been forgotten or lost.
Jack, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.